Hello, everybody. Hello, Internet. Hello, Blogging Heads viewers. This is Eli Lake again, and I'm very pleased to introduce, I think for the first time on Blogging Heads, Matthew Duss, who has his master's degree from the University of Washington, where he did his thesis on Mullah Atari, or Muqtada al-Sadr, as an accomplished chef. And you can read his blog at the Wonk Room for the Center for American Progress. Thank you very much for doing this today, Matthew.
Thanks very much, Eli. How you doing?
Very good. And just so you know, we did one of these before, but QuickTime being as unstable it is, and maybe it's my computer, but you'll never see the tape. But it was very, very good. And we hope, as best we can, we could recreate it.
We assure you, it was the greatest Blogging Heads that was ever recorded.
It was really, and this is just a tribute, to use a line from another dialogue. Anyway, sorry. The funny thing is, this dialogue doesn't even sound like the other dialogue. Anyway, and if I could just start off, let's talk a little bit about Edward Luttwak had an op-ed in the New York Times where he said that Obama would be considered by other Muslims as an apostate. What do you think of that, Matthew?
I think it's kind of ridiculous just on its face, the idea that we should be concerned that Muslims might be more outraged by a former Muslim as president than they might be by a president who invades and occupies, Muslim countries. Luttwak, I'm not sure what his expertise, if any, is in Islamic law. I think Ali Etaraz, I don't know if I'm getting his name right, had a great item in Huffington Post later that day, or maybe the following day, just pointing out how ridiculous it is for Edward Luttwak to be holding forth on Islamic law when he very obviously knows nothing about it. So, I just wanted to turn this around for a minute. Luttwak was saying, but not that there's anything wrong with that if he is. But first, I guess we should first say, there's really no one who's saying that any of this is true. There is really no evidence that anybody out there in the Muslim world considers Obama to be an apostate Muslim. This is all conjecture that's bubbling up from kind of the deepest, darkest recesses of the right wing.
Well, I am an expert on Islamic jurisprudence. You can call me the Mahdi for this dialogue.
Okay.
No, I'm kidding around. I know. I'm not going to try to venture into whether it's factually correct. Let me tell you something. I don't care. It really means absolutely nothing to me. And if a voter would vote for Obama on this basis about what Muslims, whether they would love him or hate him or whatever, it's just a silly reason to vote for someone anyway. And finally, I would say this, that I think that the conservatives, in terms of their line of attack against Obama, are really settling on the fact that he attended a church that was black liberation Christian theology for 20 years. And it's very difficult to say someone is an ex-Muslim or a secret Muslim or something like that, and then simultaneously say you do not like their radical left-wing Christianity. So on all accounts, there seems to be at least, there was this concern mainly expressed by many of Obama's defenders that, the mention of his middle name and that there would be this smear campaign to try to portray him as a secret Muslim. I think what we're seeing is actually the view is that, if anything, Obama really isn't being entirely straight as he campaigns about his dealings in the past with the left, which is a very different kind of thing to say. But I just think, this is something that really, let me just put this out there. As I said, I don't really care what the Muslims I would call, as I've said on other dialogues, Islamic supremacists who really care about things like apostasy, think about the American president. And the more important question is not whether Muslims in the region, what they think of the president or what they think of America. It's really what they think of al-Qaeda. That's, in my opinion, a much more important question, which is that if we can galvanize more Muslims, or if Muslims themselves can galvanize themselves to really defend their communities, their faith, against this aggressive Salafi and Khomeinist movement that is trying to, in many ways, enslave them, I think, and terrorize them. I think Muslims are primarily the principal victims of a lot of this terrorism. That, to me, is a far more important question of public diplomacy than, what do you think of the next president?
I agree, and I would say that I think the evidence that I've seen overwhelmingly indicates that having Barack Obama as a president would be a massive coup in terms of America's soft power. I think Andrew Sullivan had an article in the Atlantic that addressed this a few months ago. And I mean, again, that's not an argument for or against his policies. But if you're talking about, our American influence against Al Qaeda, or I think, if talking about a young Muslim who might be targeted by Al Qaeda propaganda, if he were to see someone named Barack Hussein Obama as president of the United States, that would give him second thoughts about what Osama bin Laden's saying.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm less persuaded by the soft power argument about the fact of the Obama presidency abroad, but I do think at home it would be a very good thing. If I may, can I lay this out for you, my theory on this? Okay,
go for it.
Okay, a President Obama, on the one hand, I think when he sort of took office, would be heralded as sort of the evidence of this new sort of center-left coalition, and an America that's sort of this new progressive politics that Franks and other people have been writing about for the last 5 years or so. But I think on national security issues, he has a potential domestically, which is what I really care about, to actually forge a fairly Bushian center-right consensus on national security. And what do I mean by that? I think that he will end up, though certainly I don't see into the future, but if I had to bet, I'd say he probably will end up leaving something like 50 to 60 or 70,000 troops in Iraq over his first, the 4 years of his first term, if there's a second term or not. Secondly, I think he'll close Guantanamo, but I think he would probably, his campaign has been astutely not saying anything about the question of rendition, so I think that it's very likely that he would continue to rendition very senior terrorists to countries where we know that they would be tortured. He has himself talked about, and it's on his website, talked about the idea of sort of using kinetic force in the Horn of Africa, not to mention, of course, Pakistan and Afghanistan. And I think because of him coming out, any American president will be dealing with a revolution in the military itself, which is focused on this counterinsurgency in the Anbar model. Now, let me be perfectly blunt. Working with local actors in kind of kinetic military in the overall GWAT, the Global War on Terror, that's not, in my estimation, all that different than Reagan's Contra policy, or Reagan's policy dealing with, even the Mujahideen.
Well, I hope it will be different from Reagan's Contra policy. I would hope that the people we're supporting aren't going to be terrorists. I mean,
well, okay, fine, but they're going to be fighting terrorists, but they're going to be doing so in means that we probably wouldn't approve of in the abstract. I mean, even the Anbar people that I like very much have a very rough justice. They don't have courts. They assassinate people who they suspect are al-Qaeda, and they do a lot of things that, if you just sort of took them out of context, then you didn't put them in the overall sort of context of the region, you would probably have a lot of problems with it.
Right.
Are they as bad as the terrorists they're fighting
now? In fact, I mean, that leads us, the question is whether what we're doing in Anbar is leading to a stable Iraqi state, and I don't see any evidence that it will or has.
Well, on this we very much disagree, Matthew. I would say that it's very important because the precondition for getting any stability in Iraq is to eliminate al-Qaeda and, for that matter, at least the irredentist side of the Sadr movement.
Well, at least you recognize that. At least you make that distinction. I think this is progress.
Yeah. Well, what do you mean?
Well, no, that there are irreconcilable versus reconcilable members of the Sadrist movement. I think that's very important.
Oh yeah, sure. And let me just say this: you have to make that distinction if you, like myself, believe that Petraeus has had success and you endorse his strategy, because a big part of Petraeus' strategy is delineating between the reconcilable and the unreconcilable.
Yeah, understood.
On the Sunni and the Shia side. But I would argue that is the primary cause of a lot of the violence and the threat or the potential that I think is diminished for a civil war is coming from elements that are deliberately seeking that civil war. But my point about the overall posture is that nobody in their right mind, I think at this point, would argue for invading any more countries. And nobody in their right mind really, if you really look into it, and believe me, I've looked into it, and I would like nothing more than, having like this excellent secret SEAL, special ops capacity. And we do to a certain extent, but we probably don't want Americans doing it if we can get reliable local allies doing the kinds of sabotage, surveillance and targeted killing missions that
so basically
are probably necessary.
You want America to become a terror cartel, is what you're telling me.
No, it's not a terror cartel. It's not a terror cartel at all. It's finding allies, and it's the recognition that in certain cases where you're dealing with the worst of these Islamic supremacists and their movement, it's blunting their progress. And I just think that you'd probably need the force of arms. But more important, I think that Obama, to a degree, or a McCain, I think the next president, I see that's pretty much where the military posture is probably going at this point, which is the idea of emulating the success of Anbar in other areas. I mean, let's be honest, the people that we're going to get to fight, if we're very lucky, and I don't know if this will work, in the Pashtun provinces of the federal administered tribal areas of Pakistan are not going to be human rights activists, okay? They're not. They're going to be sheikhs who we manage to bribe, or do we get them to turn on al-Qaeda, which will be to the benefit of all of humanity and civilization. However, in order to do that, it's going to be a pretty messy. I just have both eyes open, Matthew. That's
right, sure. Have both eyes open, but let's not lie to the American people that what we're doing in Iraq right now is leading to a stable state. Because it's not.
Well, I think it is leading to a stable state. I think it's fairly. I think that you're working with some people with some pretty rough histories, but I think that they're on the side of the angels right now.
Right. Well, okay. You're working with people who have told us, who have told the army, who have told reporters, who have told anybody who's paying attention that as soon as they're done with al-Qaeda, they intend to focus their guns on the Iranian occupation, by which they mean the Iraqi government. Okay, and they don't mean Sadr, by the way.
I know where you're getting. That's not what the leadership of the Anbar Awakening has said at all. In fact, the Shia Interior Ministry, after they killed Abu Risha, erected a huge shrine, for him and pronounced him a huge hero. There have been more and more coordination with the Maliki government. There have been at times threats of local police strikes and so forth, but largely this stuff has been. Has not come to pass. If anything, we've seen that these people are interested in the same thing the Kurds are interested in, which is a sort of basic federalism, which anybody looking at Iraq is a pretty good outcome right now, much better than having the area, that geographic area of Anbar, ruled by effectively the Islamic State of Iraq, which is effectively like an arm of al-Qaeda. Far better to have it ruled by people who don't. I don't think that they have the same kind of quarrel. I don't think that they're going to turn their guns on I just think that's overblown.
Okay, so maybe they're all lying. But if we're sitting here...
No, they're not all lying, and they don't promise that. There's one guy, and I'm forgetting his name right now, who was interviewed. There's one guy who sort of sometimes says all this stuff, but he's not a central leader of the Awakening movement. And the great news is that I think my understanding is that the Awakening movement is finally going to set up a D.C. office where journalists like you and myself, are going to be able to kind of check these kind of quotes against it. But when I've spoken to the Anbar people, they've never said anything like that. Sheikh Abu Risha, when he was alive, and then now his brothers, they have made it very clear. If anything, they want to join the government. They're saying, I wish they were quicker in allowing us, to give us uniforms so we can sort of do this legitimately as part of the government.
I just think that's like a red herring. I'm not saying that there's no chance that it'll work. I'm just saying that if this policy of empowering local tribal leaders, empowering them and making these deals with them, and by the way, these deals are being made with the U.S. Army. They're not being made with the central government. This policy of empowering local tribal leaders, if it ends up in being a stable Iraqi state, that will be the first time this policy has ever worked in history. Okay? Understand that?
Listen, I'm saying, okay, you understand that you could not have the prospect of a stable Iraqi government if al-Qaeda was in control of large swaths of territory.
Understood,
right?
Yeah. It's a
so if you're using counterinsurgency... Right, but I'm saying if you're using counterinsurgency, okay, then, you're dealing with this problem. You don't want to have al-Qaeda have a safe haven, okay? So you have to work and you have to try to get the local population. The way to get the local population on your side in Iraq, in that area, was to work with the tribal sheikhs. Now, the tribal sheikhs, in this particular case, I do not think harbor the imperial ambitions of the Qaeda regime that they replaced. In fact, we know they don't. And while you say that, these deals are made with the U.S. military and so forth, also as part of, when people join the, sort of right side, they have to say that they kind of pledge at least a degree of understanding or recognition of the central government. And there's plenty of these things that, plenty of times where they do recognize that. Now, and also Maliki at one point deputized the Anbar Salvation Front and this stuff, so it's not like there isn't some coordination with this. I'm just saying that a precondition, you couldn't get anything if al-Qaeda can have any kind of territorial control. It's very important that you defeat al-Qaeda and that you reconcile on the Sadr side.
Right, I understand. Like,
and
given
how bad if once you do that, then you have a prospect.
Yes, given how bad the situation was, I understand. We did certain things, or Petraeus did certain things to bring the violence down. I mean, yes, less people dying, less violence. That's a good thing. Let's think about the project of creating the Iraqi state. I mean, I'm not saying it's certainly not an easy question. But I'm saying let's leave all the surges working, aside for a minute. Let's think about the project of Iraq. Let's think about where we are. I agree that battling Iraq, al-Qaeda, counterinsurgency. I don't think battling the Mahdi army and the Sadrists is a counterinsurgency. That's an inter-Shia civil war. And it's just a complete misstatement of the strategic environment to treat it like just another counterinsurgency. I mean, the Sadrists, they estimate something like 2.5, more than that, million followers who identify as Sadrists. This is not a movement that you're going to marginalize, okay? This is not a movement that you're just going to tamp down, even though that unfortunately has seemed to be the U.S. policy.
Well, the U.S. policy has been to make a distinction, along with the Iraqi government, between the legitimate Sadr government, or the Office of the Martyr of the Sadr, which you've written a lot about, and elements of the Sadrist government that continue their criminal kidnapping and campaigns of violence, not just largely, as I said before, against Iraqi civilians, and also, by the way, the Shia governors of two provinces, the Sadrists ultimately kind of claimed. And so this irredentist part, and at times, many times, Muqtada al-Sadr himself has said, people who continue to sort of take up arms in this manner, in an insurrectionary gangster way, are not really part of my movement. He'd said that. He also, by the way, wavers. He sometimes says, wait a second, they are part of the Sadr movement, and so forth. So we've been dealing with a paradigm for over a year now in Iraq of trying to sort of distinguish between bad apples, if you will, and then the rest of what you say is a sort of legitimate Sadrist movement.
Well, no,
I
don't think there's anybody with any credibility who doesn't say that they are a legitimate political movement.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not really going to argue with you that there aren't followers of Sadr. I mean, I think that he's not as, he doesn't have the ability to sort of set the country on fire the way he did in 2004, obviously, when he was in the bunker in Najaf.
What makes you say that?
No, nonetheless, he does, yes. He provides the social services of Sadr City, which is, as you, I think, pointed out in private conversation with me, is the second largest city in terms of population in Iraq. Right. So, yeah. Okay, you have to in some ways deal with Sadr. But if Sadr is going to continue to sort of turn a blind eye or not assist in the arrest of these other people who make life very much ungovernable and have challenged the central sort of monopoly of the force of the Iraqi government, then the turning point that we saw at the end of March and with the Basra campaign is that this Shia government will go after them, and it has paid benefits in terms of instilling confidence of other Sunni political leaders.
That's just a real mischaracterization of what was going on. I think Petraeus even recognized, and Sadr has done this consistently since 2004, that he has occasionally frozen the Mahdi army and allowed these rogue elements, as he called them, to be picked off. All right, so he has been working, and what unfortunately had happened is that the Iraqi army, working with the U.S. Army, units of which were controlled by the Badr Brigade, have been kind of using the excuse of going after special groups to just round up rank-and-file members of the Mahdi army, and this is what caused eventually the Mahdi army to this fighting to flare up. Now, that's not to deny. I certainly don't deny that there are these Iranian-backed special groups. I think that's a term that the Iranians came up with, although it's something that Petraeus started using. But the way that Petraeus has used it and the way that President Bush has used it has been it's been a way to just kind of say, any Sadrist element that we choose to fight right now is by definition special groups. I just don't, that's just not accurate. So it goes to the whole question of accurately describing the strategic environment, which I don't think that President Bush has done.
Well, I mean, I want to say a couple things about that. First of all, I mean, listen, we're not there, so we're going on what the U.S. military is necessarily saying.
Fair enough.
Okay? But if if the U.S. military is correct and Petraeus is correct, and I don't see reasons why he would lie to Congress, though certainly some elements of the progressive movement think he has in the past, that if you buy what he's saying, then the Iranians are essentially trying to sabotage the Iraqi government at this point because they're responsible for the projectile explosives that go into the green zone. They're responsible for arming the most sort of irredentist factions. And the other thing is that we have to talk about Basra, which is that Basra was essentially left to local criminal gangs, which, as I understand it, don't have the kind of national allegiances that we like that sort of fit into a neat movement. So, these were really just sort of mafias competing for turf. And at least according to the New York Times, which finally sent some reporters down to Basra, the Iraqi army has done a pretty good job of at least, restoring some order and establishing some control over
I agree.
there.
That's a very good thing.
And that is a good thing. And I would say that, in what we're seeing now is, I guess, a ceasefire, and we don't really know what it means, because the clause that's, I think, is the most important, and I think you would agree, is what does heavy weapons mean? And the heavy weapons that apparently Sadr's, agreed to give up for his people, what does that mean? But the one thing I would say is this, is that in this period of prolonged fighting since the end of March till now, we have seen a number of times where Sadr has made a lot of announcements that haven't necessarily come true. I think it's fair to say that at one point, at least he or the Iranians or whoever it was tried to sort of, basically assert their will, similar to what Hezbollah did in Beirut recently. And they managed to not succeed in that. And finally, there has been agreements of sorts that we will stop trying to target Sadr Mahdi army leaders that have not, or at least Sadr has said he's gotten that agreement, but then people continue to be arrested and rounded up.
Right.
And, is everybody, as bad an apple as the government says or the U.S. military has? I'm being honest. I'm just not in a position I haven't seen their dossiers. But as far as a sort of contest of wills, I would say so far, Sadr is the one who needs to probably show that he's gained something, and I don't know exactly at this point what he's gained.
No, that's a good point. But I would just say let's look back at the various uprisings. 2003 and then twice in 2004,
Sure.
Again in 2005.
Right.
This is part of a pattern. He'll make a statement, he makes a stand, they melt away. Someone comes in and kind of brokers a ceasefire. People on both sides break it, but at the end of the day, the Mahdi army stays intact. They keep their weapons, and there's Muqtada al-Sadr with his millions of followers. So, yeah, I think it's a good thing, as I said, that the Iraqi government, the Iraqi army is in control of Basra, that life is going back to normal. But getting to this question of who is Iran backing, I know that you and I, just in private conversations, have been back and forth over this. There is a controversy over this.
Yeah.
It's very clear to me that Iran's primary ally is ISKI, the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq, formerly SCIRI, Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, founded in Iran in the early 1980s. Their militia, the Badr Brigade, was founded by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, trained and indoctrinated by the Quds Force.
Yeah, that's all true.
They came in after the Iraq invasion, and Iran had intended for SCIRI to kind of be their, I won't say instrument, because I don't think that there's a puppet relationship going on here, but I think they just intended SCIRI to be their main ally, and still intend SCIRI now, ISKI to be their main ally. However, someone was in Iraq with a lot of legitimacy and a lot of followers, Muqtada al-Sadr, and unlike the United States, who tried to ignore the movement or suppress it or just deny its legitimacy, the Iranians kind of recognized it and moved to manage it. And part of managing it was infiltrating it and to some extent trying to discredit it, which is, I think, what has been going on consistently since at least 2004, early 2004.
Well, I do agree with you that the Quds Force and the Revolutionary Guard, and now I think we hear Hezbollah, has tried to infiltrate cadres of the Mahdi army. I disagree with you. Or let me put it like this. First of all, maybe we can put it on one of the links if the New Republic can get their archive up. But before the war, I did write, look out for SCIRI and Dawa. They're trained by the Revolutionary Guard. So I've been keenly aware for some time, since 2002, of this problem of the sort of theocratic parties. One of the things I noticed is that that we've seen some distancing. And one of the, I don't know, I have a sort of saying about the Middle East, which is that it's very difficult to actually purchase people, but more likely that you rent them.
Exactly.
And that what I think happened with SCIRI or ISKI now, is a couple things. One, that at least their leadership rejected Vilya Faqih, which is the rule of jurisprudence, and which is how, which is one of the fundamental principles of how the Khomeinist state of Iran differs from at least what Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani believes should be the role of the clerisy in an Iraqi state, or is proper Shiism. And in so doing, they align themselves with the Hausa in Najaf. Now, what had happened with the Hausa of Najaf? Sadr felt in 2003 that he killed al-Khawi, and he literally sort of encamped himself and almost tried to kill, or said to have tried to kill Sistani himself in 2004, where he was really making, I think, almost attempted putsch within the sort of clerical establishment of Najaf. Today, the Sadr sort of emissaries have asked for the guidance of the Hausa as to what they ought to do with regards to disbanding their militia. They didn't receive an answer. But as is the chatter, as I understand it, around Najaf, I'm getting this from my friend Nibras Kazemi in his fantastic blog, Talisman Gate, which we should link to, is that the response was, well, you didn't consult us when you formed the militia, so why are you consulting us when you're trying to disband the militia? But that's, I think, significant, because I think ISKI is now closer to Najaf and a real Iraqi Shiism. They certainly haven't given up the idea that they are a Shia confessional party, but they're not necessarily as aligned, at least in that respect, with Iran. And I think that that's significant. The other thing is this, is that the Iraqi government, Maliki is a Dawa man, but he rejected the aid that was offered by Ahmadinejad in the last visit. Sistani would not meet with the Iranian president. And now you're seeing the Iraqi army and ISKI itself supporting military actions against what we'd have to say, or at least in part, are some Iranian factions within the Mahdi army. Sure. So I agree with you. Yes, the Iranians try to play as many sides as they can in the Iraqi conflict, similar to what the Syrians tried to do in the Lebanon civil war of the 1980s. However, at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of those factions are at the same level, as loyal as they were in prior years or even before the invasion. Right. And I think we're seeing a kind of movement from ISKI. It's not perfect. There are certainly probably Badr brigades that are probably under direct control or being subsidized directly by the Revolutionary Guard at a local level. But I think that the leadership of the organization, the leadership of the party itself, has begun to really move away from Iran, and I see that as a very good development.
Well, and just to kind of argue with your interpretation of Sistani's role in this. I mean, there are questions as to how clearly ISKI kind of how ISKI really kind of finessed the whole guardianship of the jurisprudence question. I mean, yes, they kind of turned their focus towards Sistani. However, it's kind of it's very clear that they could have done this as far as bucking up their own nationalist credentials vis-a-vis Sadr, because that continues to be a huge handicap for them. They fled, the Hakims fled Iraq during the great oppression of the great persecution of the Shias that began in the late 70s and early 80s, while the Sadr stayed. That's a huge, that's a big, great hand that Sadr has to play, and he's continued to play it. As far as Sistani's role, I mean, Sistani has, there's evidence that, I forget when this was, it was when Sistani, I think it was in 2004, when Sistani went abroad for medical care, and there was the attempt to kill Sadr. Right. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So, a lot of people I've seen and I've talked to and I've read suggest that he didn't want to be in Najaf when Muqtada was rubbed out. Unfortunately, Muqtada, like Bugs Bunny, was able to avoid that. But since then, in ending the Najaf crisis...
Would you agree that Sadr has gone closer to Qom? Obviously, he's there right now. He's moved closer to Iran, as it looks like ISKI has moved
I agree with that, but as I said last time, and I'll repeat this time, I think Sadr's program has always had a very strong nationalist component. In fact, leading up to the Iraq War, there were huge crackdowns by the Iranian government of Sadrist adherents in Iran, because the Iranian government recognized that Sadiq al-Sadr, Muqtada's father, was proposing a theory of guardianship of the jurisprudence separate from Iran, which was, in a sense, in a very real sense, a refutation or a contradiction of Khomeinism, and they recognized the danger of that. So,
well, I'm no Islamic jurisprudence scholar, but
neither am I.
Muki's not his dad, as I understand it.
But I think Sadr's closeness to I think Sadr has developed a relationship with Iran, in part because of the U.S.'s posture toward him. I mean, he's been very clear. He wants the U.S. out. He wants the occupation over. And the U.S. has chosen to work with Skiri over Sadr for a number of reasons, but one of the main ones is they've been willing to work with us. So, I mean, I think we have a similar... we have a similar situation.
He's like a mullah in training, I mean, he's just not the theologian or religious Shia leader of his father or his grandfather.
All right, no doubt. But I think he does have a political legitimacy that matches many Shia leaders, and that's an interesting development in and of itself. But just, I'm sorry, yes. I lost my train of thought. But
no, this has been very, very good.
But just, getting back to my main point, not to run too far afield, getting back to my main point, I think the success, Iraq will fail or succeed, I think, to a great extent, to how we're able to accommodate the Sadr movement. A lot of this depends on Muqtada himself, but I think basically in order to accommodate this movement, and we have to accommodate this movement of 2.5 or more million people, we have to give some sign that we are eventually getting out of Iraq. Now, Muqtada hasn't said get out tomorrow. He said, give me a sign that you are getting out. And I think we simply have to do that to bring him to more successfully bring him into the political process.
All right, let me just say a couple things, and then anyway, let me just very quickly. I think that we tried for a while until the end of 2006 to work with Sadr and bring him into the government in the hopes that that his participation in the political process and his control of ministries would moderate him and give him a stake in the government as opposed to trying to undermine it. And what we found is that he really was, or his people were, the worst of the ethnic cleansers. And what he did to the hospitals of Baghdad is a war crime and an atrocity. And in that respect, yes, Sadr one day probably should play a role, or his movement should play a role, in Iraq as a political party. But it cannot play a role on the terms that it played before.
Oh, no,
and
no
I
doubt.
think that insofar as the Iraqi government is trying to show that and is not going to be treated the way the Lebanese government has just been treated by Hezbollah,
right.
and that basically the attempted putsch, and to sort of establish, no, wait a second, you are not the veto here,
right.
and you do not get to use the government to advance your sectarian agenda. In that respect, I would say that it is a sort of line that has to be walked. But I see the evidence right now that, listen, when Iraq is debated in the States here, we tend to lose nuance and passions get very heated. But in Iraq, it seems that Ryan Crocker and David Petraeus and Nouri al-Maliki kind of understand this. And the idea that, they're going to kill Sadr or they're going to, these sorts of ideas are not really being discussed. What they're really trying to do is they're really trying to sort of make it very clear that there are elements within his movement that I think he can't control, or at least we
right.
were led to believe that need to be sort of eliminated and taken out. He is, by the way, sort of giving us his communications from Iran, so maybe he's
right.
not being allowed to be entirely candid when he goes on Al Jazeera and other Arab satellite stations.
No, I really don't think there's very much evidence that he's under their control. I mean, I think if you watch the Al Jazeera...
No, I said entirely candid, though. I don't know that
the Al Jazeera interview was actually really interesting. Did you watch that, the end of the March interview?
I read the transcript of it. I didn't actually.
I mean, first of all, as other people have commented to me, and I think it's true, he's lost a lot of weight. So either he's jogging, or he's very ill, or something. Which is, other people have said there was that rumor that he was in a coma in a hospital. But
there was a rumor that he's a big cocaine head.
Right. Hey, and
maybe he's on the
he wouldn't be the first president. But anyway.
Yeah.
His bearing and his ease in front of the camera, I think, was really really different. I mean, he has come a long way as a public speaker. So, I don't know what else to say really about that. But just getting back.
But I remember, at the end of March, though, he sort of looked ridiculous because he was saying, he had a series of statements that he said, and he would we're never going to give up, and we are going to give up, and it's just going to be this and it's going to be that. And I guess I got the impression, not that he was under anyone's control, but that his hands were a little bit tied based on his physical location and the fact that clearly, as we both sort of say, that there are elements of his organization that call themselves the Mahdi Army that are in fact loyal to a man named Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Quds Force.
Right. I agree with that. And just getting back quickly to Petraeus and Crocker, I didn't mean to imply that they weren't being honest. I'm just saying they're serving a policy, and that policy is stay in Iraq. So they're doing what they have to do. They're making the best out of a bad situation, and I think Petraeus, should be applauded.
I don't really think it's the end of the policy. I think the policy is stabilize Iraq, get the casualty counts on.
Okay, yes, stabilize Iraq for what goal? I mean, the question
population
remains whether we intend to, whether the Bush administration is still wedded to this kind of bong hit fantasy of putting these permanent bases in Iraq and making it, a place from which the U.S. projects power throughout the Middle East. I mean, until we drop that kind of, drop that idea, I think.
Well, what if the Iraqi government asks us? Well, I mean, if there's a status of forces agreement that says we would like so and so many troops, on this kind of role, under this kind of, under this kind of rules. I mean, like if the Iraqi government asks for that,
if the Iraqi government, after the elections, it's got to be a government that the majority of Iraqi people think is legitimate, and I just don't think we really have that.
I totally agree that there should be a status of forces agreement, a permanent status of forces agreement that's negotiated after the 2009 federal elections.
Right.
And, if that government after 2009 says you need to get all of your troops out of there, then I would accept that.
Right.
And if they said that's why it's, by the way, in negotiation, there's a good chance maybe that they would say more troops the better. The Kurds certainly want American troops in Iraq. I think that there's evidence now that the new parties that will emerge from the successful victory against al-Qaeda and the irredentists on the Sunni side will probably want an American force presence. And it's unclear what we're going to get from the Shia side, but the Shia side, at least so far, at least this government, is saying that they still want American troops there. So, you can call it a bong-hit fantasy, but if in fact there is, maybe this brings us back to Obama, but, if there is a request for a certain number of troops in Iraq as an overwatch function, as some of the kind of military wonks have been talking about in this sort of long-term future. What's wrong with that? If the Iraqi government asks for it, how is that different from, as McCain says, Japan or Korea or anything else?
Well, right. I think, as Samantha Power said in her much maligned interview, I forget where it was, in Scotland, she said, given the situation on the ground, President Obama will obviously not have his hands tied. I mean, his intention right now is to get the United States out of Iraq. I think he recognizes what a lot of people don't, is that the U.S. occupation of Iraq is in a lot of respects driving the violence. There are certain areas where, yes, the United States is holding back violence against civilians. That's not true all over Iraq, and I think we really need to understand that. And I think that is, one of the places where there's a big cleavage among war supporters and those who want to end the war, is that people.
Yeah, I don't think the occupation is a cause of the violence. I think that a cause of the violence are largely the forces that the American military and more the Iraqi security forces are trying to.
I think that's kind
destroy.
of a cop out. I mean, I think you got to recognize that the presence of a foreign army, which is not subject to your laws, a military occupation, is a systemic form of violence against a population. There's just really no getting around that. I mean, people's doors getting kicked in.
The UN recognizes that the U.S. is going to play a role in Iraq. The Iraqi government has formally said we want the troops there.
Okay,
so
I'm sure that makes a huge difference to the dude who has his door kicked in the middle of the night. If you're going to say it's an occupation,
then you have to. Well, but I'm saying that then you have to sort of say that you don't think that I have criticisms of the election, especially on the Sunni side, but if anything, what we found is that the parties that represent the Sunnis are the ones who were trying to get resolutions asking for the troops to leave, and the parties that are very likely to replace them in the provincial elections this fall on the Sunni side will be asking the troops to stay. So if you're going to call it an occupation, then you have to, at least tether it to some sort of standard definition of what an occupation is. And an occupation, as I understand it, would be the presence of a foreign army without the consent of the local population. And we seem to have at least some indicators, because we did push for some elections, that they want, at least for now, as the country is in all this violence, the presence of a foreign military. Now, more importantly, what is that foreign military doing? That foreign military is largely protecting neighborhoods in Baghdad, for the most part, against people whose intention is to start a confessional civil war and who use the most violent and awful tactics available that maximize or try to maximize civilian casualties. So I don't believe that al-Qaeda sends car bombers into pet markets to kill Iraqis because of necessarily the foreign occupation. I just think it's because, or what they call a foreign occupation, I think it's because al-Qaeda are imperial Islamic supremacist sadists that seek to kill Iraqis in order to eventually impose their will over a large swath of Muslims.
Sure. I mean, I don't disagree with that, but let's, that gets to the question of, not invading countries, toppling their governments, and creating the situations where al-Qaeda comes in to start a civil war.
Well, I don't think that there's any. Well, I mean, I don't think anyone. I mean, as far as looking forward, I don't think we should invade any more countries either.
Well, I'm good. I'm glad.
We did invade this country, though.
But I mean, there seems to be a certain sense where conservatives want to just kind of leave the whole. They don't want to relitigate the invasion of Iraq or whatever they call it. They're basically like, oh, let's just start from the surge and go forward. No, I'm sorry. I mean, we can talk about the surge.
Well, I mean, no, actually, your side likes to say, constantly go back to 2003 and use that as an argument for leaving. I mean, whereas I'm acknowledging, I've said this before, if we'd known everything that we knew now, I wouldn't have supported the invasion. I wouldn't have supported the invasion knowing everything that I know now. And I think a lot of Democrats and liberal internationalists and liberal interventionists also supported this invasion, except the difference is that right now, I believe that we need to sort of deal with the situation as it is and not use the argument against invading in the first place as an argument for why we ought to leave.
Right, no, I agree with that, and I would kind of dispute your characterization of my side, however you define it.
Hey, we're back, and it's now a new topic, which is 21 J Street, my little joke. J is the street that doesn't exist in Washington, and it is a street that signifies ideas that people are afraid to think, or something.
Or that are unrepresented, yes.
Unrepresented ideas that maybe would make the world better. And J Street would be an alternative to AIPAC. Mm-hmm. And Bush is in Israel for Israel's 60th anniversary celebrations, where then he's off to Saudi Arabia. Just a side note, if I could say, it's a little odd that he's going to Saudi Arabia basically to ask them to pump more oil, like after celebrating Israel's 60th birthday. I'm happy that he's celebrating Israel's 60th, but, scheduling the trip right after that is...
Yeah, it would have been nice, however, if Bush could avoid God-winning during his speech to the Knesset this morning. I thought, was it me, or was that a little bit out of the ordinary, where a U.S. president speaks to a foreign country, speaks to a foreign government, and attacks the other political party?
What exactly? He wasn't specific, right? What did he say again? He said
he talked about elements in political his opponents, or however he phrased it, who believe in speaking to Iran and Israel's enemies in the way of appeasement, and made a reference to the Nazis and Neville Chamberlain and all this kind of thing. And then McCain came in and totally agreed. And it just seems like. Is that the place? Is this? It's kind of consistent with the Bush administration's insistence
he could have been talking about members of his own
everything
party.
Having to do with national security. Excuse me?
He could have been talking about, like, Chuck Hagel. I mean, he's a Republican. No. I mean, I think he's trying to make a point more about, his approach to the war versus necessarily, like, one party. I think there are plenty of Democrats who generally don't agree and are made uncomfortable by the idea of having high-level meetings with Iran. Mm-hmm. Certainly Hillary Clinton, as we know, voted for that resolution that would encourage the White House to designate the Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist entity. And Barack Obama didn't. There is a debate in the Democratic Party, but certainly by no means... I don't even know... Barack Obama has really changed his tune on this as well. He's now saying the reason he thinks that there should be more diplomacy with Iran is to get them to stop supporting terrorism all around the world and to end their nuclear weapons program. Conceding on a factual basis, empirical basis, something that at least some people kind of in the progressive side of the Democratic Party think are like, kind of phony, not real facts. You know what I'm saying? Phony, made-up things that, are the Bush administration is coming up to scare people.
But who doubts that Iran supports terrorism? Is there any serious person who doubts that?
I think that there are a lot of serious people who doubted a year ago, at least, that the Iranians were playing any major role in terrorism in Iraq. And have heard, at least in the academy, there was for years a debate about whether Imad Mughniya was really part of Hezbollah and how tight Hezbollah was with Iran. You'd certainly run across this in a certain sort of policy circles that that Iran's role in sort of fomenting and supporting terrorism was way overblown, and it was in Israel's interest and so forth.
No, I think there's a genuine debate. I don't think there's any debate that Iran uses terrorism, supports terrorist groups, as various levers with which to affect, or enact, try to create the hegemony in the Middle East. But there's disagreement as to the actual nature of the regime, what's their goal, and whether...
Can they be bargained with,
Right, exactly. I mean,
well, I don't know. I think that you would find... I think you would find there's that new organization, which I call in my head Hands Off Iran, but I know it's not called that. With we should also talk about J Street, though. So let's talk about J Street. Okay. We got a little bit. So give me your you like J Street, right?
I do. Yes.
Okay.
I think
break it down.
J Street is starting to build, to represent what they see as a constituency that is not spoken for, which wants to redefine what it means to be pro-Israel, and I certainly support that. I consider myself certainly pro-Israel. I'm often very critical of certain Israeli policies, especially as they relate to the continued occupation and settlements in the West Bank. I think they are a serious contributor to the violence and to the hatred of Israel. But moreover, I think what J Street is trying to do, on top of actual lobbying, it's trying to just provide another voice. I mean, we don't hear AIPAC criticizing the settlements. We don't hear AIPAC. AIPAC too often, it seems to me, works to douse any real debate about Israeli policies.
I think AIPAC tries to sort of establish an awesome congressional bipartisan consensus on supporting the U.S.-Israel relationship. In the Oslo years, and more recently with, I guess, the sort of request for the Annapolis Project, AIPAC has taken on elements of the right that don't want to give any money to the Palestinian Authority and sort of established that this was all sort of part of the pro-Israel agenda. When there wasn't a peace process for much of the Bush presidency, AIPAC certainly supported Israel's right to use targeted strikes and killings and so forth. But I think that what AIPAC tries to do is, it does try to kind of create a very imposing consensus and a bipartisan consensus in Congress.
No, I think that the parameters of that consensus are false. I mean, just to get into what you said about getting money for the Palestinians from the peace trials, that's just flat out wrong. I mean, AIPAC, and in fact, AIPAC was criticized for this by, was either Perez or Rabin during one of the, around Oslo, there was...
in the beginning of Oslo,
right.
They were criticized for having like a sort of element that was also lobbying the executive branch, which they felt was the proper job of the Israeli embassy in Washington.
No. What I'm specifically thinking about was a bill, and I know this is in J.J. Goldberg's book, Jewish Power. I'm sorry if I'm forgetting the details. It has to do with a specific bill that went out to a certain amount of money that was going to the Palestinians, and AIPAC essentially just cut the money down. And Rabin came in and just dressed them down, and they were like, don't get in the way here. So what I'm trying to say is that AIPAC, I think it's pretty clear that AIPAC has always hewn pretty hard to the right. I mean, they are by no means...
I disagree. I remember, for example, in when there was discussions with Hafez al-Assad in 2000 through the Shepherdsburg, West Virginia meeting, with Israel, that there was initial lobbying for possibly, what kind of aid you would give to Syria, similar to Egypt. And there were groups that were to the right at the time who didn't like the peace process, like the Zionist Organization of America, that were saying they were being persecuted on the Hill by AIPAC lobbyists who were trying to extract at the time, basically to kind of keep the appropriators open to the idea of, taking Syria. That when the Israeli government and the U.S. government basically kind of are moving in a peace process-like direction, AIPAC lobbies with their power and influence in the foreign aid process for money, ultimately, to support that. And when that's not the case, they don't. But the charter of AIPAC is basically to support the U.S.-Israeli relationship. And I know that there has been a series of critiques from Michael Masick and others, like M.J. Rosenberg and so forth, that have argued that, AIPAC really is a stalking horse for the right. But from the perspective of people who really are on the right, AIPAC is considered a stalking horse for the peace process when there's a peace process.
Okay, but see, that's a false argument. Just to say that AIPAC isn't as crazy as the craziest right-wingers, I mean, that's really not saying
Well,
that.
no, but it's actually what I'm saying is that AIPAC represents what the Israeli government wants and what the U.S. government wants. And there was a period in the beginning of Oslo when there was something of a disconnect there. But in the past 15 years, it's largely been, or 12 years or whatever, it's largely been the case that AIPAC has pretty much been, or tried its best to be in line with the Israeli government. And there are times when AIPAC is used, especially on sensitive issues having to do with like technology transfers for weapon systems, as an envoy to pressure the Israelis from the U.S. government. Yeah. I mean, I'm just saying it's like an institution.
If the U.S. policy is for a peace process, and you have like the Netanyahu government, which came in and proceeded to drag its feet and renegotiate various elements of Oslo, and why is AIPAC supporting that? Why wouldn't AIPAC continue to support the U.S. policy pushing forward on things that were agreed upon in Oslo? I mean, I don't want
because it supports the U.S.-Israeli relationship. It doesn't just support whatever the State Department at any given time wants to do. It supports...
No, not at any given time. It was something that was agreed for and that Netanyahu reneged on.
Well, but Netanyahu ultimately ended up signing the Wye River Accord, and Netanyahu ultimately... And keep in mind, his election was made possible because... I think of that guy, what is his name, the engineer or whatever, there was a series of terrorist attacks, and that there was a view, and Netanyahu campaigned on this view, that he wasn't against the peace process. What he said is he isn't for any concessions until Arafat did more to control the terrorists.
Well, right, and that's consistently been the kind of chicken and egg argument that the Likud has tried to make. I think the engineer was the one who was assassinated by, by Perez as part of his Get Tough on terrorism campaign that seems to happen every time there's an Israeli election. It's time to get tough on the Palestinians again, which resulted in a whole spate of Hamas suicide bombings, which eventually led to Netanyahu winning the election. But I don't want to get sidetracked in just AIPAC. I mean, I agree that J Street is trying to...
Well, my problem with J Street is that, if it's AIPAC is for, or the Israeli government is for a two-state solution, President Bush, whatever you want to say about him, is the first president who's uttered the phrase Palestinian state. He says he wants one, which is unlikely at this point, by the end of his presidency. Under President Bush, the holdout of the entire Israeli political consensus, Ariel Sharon, abandoned the sort of hard right idea that Israel was entitled to settle the land that it won in the Six-Day War.
Okay, well, see,
hold on, wait a second. Bush really did do a lot in terms of the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. Before there was the Lebanon War, the party that was created by the kind of political earthquake of Sharon giving up the settlement movement was Kadima, and Kadima wanted to do a unilateral withdrawal and end most of the occupation in the West Bank. And what's more, that you've seen the entire time Bush has sort of said that one of the reasons why he wanted to do Iraq, now we can argue whether we can argue whether he's correct or not, I don't think he was correct, was because it would make a political settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict possible. And I think what you've seen, at least in Israel, which is there's a bit of despair right now. People don't really know what to do. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the Israeli politics have changed dramatically in the last 5 years. They just have. We've now got, it's now very much of a fringe position to have the argument that Israel has a right to control, ultimately, the West Bank. Ultimately, Israelis sort of see themselves exiting. And for the first time, at least, you're seeing some enforcement of outposts in the further reaching areas. Now, we've talked about this last time. The settlements around that ring road around Jerusalem, the Israelis are trying to consolidate and effectively creating these facts on the ground. But even Taba acknowledged that these older settlements, which are very close to the Israeli capital, would be part of Israel in exchange for swaps and carve-outs of land in pre-67 Israel.
Right. I mean, what I don't really understand is why we're, making a virtue of necessity here. Like, Israel deserves to be congratulated for finally realizing that they cannot sustain a military occupation and effort to colonize and subjugate the Palestinians in the West Bank. Any more than I think that Hamas would deserve to be congratulated for dropping the thing in their charter that says they want to destroy Israel. I mean, that's the price for joining.
Well, but if Hamas did drop, I'm not asking for congratulations, Matthew. I'm only saying that if Hamas was to drop that in their charter and that you started to hear a very different tone from Hamas leaders, we would both say, well, there's been a real political change among Hamas.
I totally agree.
Maybe,
but let's also point out that Likud party is still part of their plank involves the entirety of the West Bank.
If I may, though, I mean, yes, that is part of, yes. At this point, Likud does not go along with Kadima in that regard. But I very much doubt
we have no problem with negotiating with a government of which Likud is a part.
Well, but I'm saying I very much doubt that Benjamin Netanyahu, if he were to become prime minister, there may be another election soon because of this political scandal, would do. I think that the reason. By the way, I think everybody for now in Israel is against pulling out of the West Bank because they're afraid that a rocket war that would be launched from the West Bank would be able to hit Dimona, Tel Aviv, and Ben Gurion Airport, not to mention Jerusalem.
Right.
But there is still, at least I'm saying it's a psychic change in Israel, which is that they don't somehow expect, as they did in the 80s and the 70s, for these refuseniks Jews from the Soviet Union to come and resettle the land and have a demographic majority. That's out the window. And they certainly don't think that they can survive as a state occupying millions of Palestinians, period. So in that respect, the political horizon is there on the Jewish on that side, and I would argue, I bet, at least Sari Nusseibeh says so, according to his polling and according to his work, that it's also there on the Palestinian side. So where it's not there is the party that's in control of Gaza, and it's very unclear whether that party in control of Gaza are they really are they the authentic Palestinian nationalists? Right. Or are they, in many ways, I don't know, they're acting in some ways as a cat's paw, it seems, of the Iranians to a degree. But also, they also have an element of Hamas, which sees Palestine as yet another Islamic state in a wider constellation of Islamic states.
No, I agree with that. That's an important point, but I think that's important. I don't think it's accurate to say that Hamas is a cat's paw. I think you have a situation in which Hamas was kind of forced to look to Iran for support. And Iran, again, uses Hamas just to pull levers, and whenever they want to start trouble, they kind of they reach out. But Hamas does have. Not to downplay the kind of evil quality of Hamas's charter. I mean, there's a lot in there, obviously, that I just don't get with. Okay, I don't think I need to even say that. But, they do have a pretty complex program. I mean, it's not right to just call them pan-Islamic. It's not right to just call them nationalists. They do have a kind of interesting intertwining of Palestinian nationalism and pan-Islamism. And I do agree that, this is an area where the Iranian government has a problem with them. I think it was Khamenei made a statement against Hamas a few weeks ago, just kind of decrying and condemning the nationalist component of Hamas's rhetoric. But getting away from this, if we can get back to the American side of the debate for a minute. Sure. What I support J Street for a number of reasons, but also just as a voice, as a way of kind of pulling the debate back into some kind of reasonable center. Because, we look at the situation that took place with Robert Malley over the last few weeks, which I think is just disgraceful. Robert Malley is a researcher. He's a former negotiator for the Clinton administration with the Palestinians. He works for the International Crisis Group. And people had been smearing Robert Malley for months, as anti-Israel. Robert Malley is in no sense anti-Israel. Let's just make that very clear. He has been critical of Israel. He has, people gave him a lot of grief. The thing that really bothered a lot of the nutcases about Robert Malley was this item he wrote for the New York Review of Books, looking at the Camp David negotiations and suggesting that maybe the very simple explanation that it was all Arafat's fault, maybe things were a little bit more complicated than that. And this is why people have looked at that and said, oh, well, he's anti-Israel for suggesting
a little
that it
bit more than
Arafat's
that. I remember that New York Review of Books piece. He said basically that Arafat was not the bad faith actor, that every other credible witness, including Palestinians, I might add, said that he was. And the other thing is that in Robert Malley's...
that's not true. I don't think that's true at all.
Well, he said that Arafat had made mistakes, but he couldn't have helped to make those mistakes. My point is that there were a lot of people who failed to understand how dangerous Arafat was, Robert Malley kind of being chief among them, but I would include in that people who disagreed and fought with him at the time, like Dennis Ross, who, everybody turned a blind eye to the fact that this was one of the most corrupt swindles in the world, which is that all this aid money was going into his pockets in these private bank accounts. And he was stealing Palestine's future, essentially, in order to kind of keep a mafia-like control over his political movement.
Yeah, fair enough. But I mean, I'm not even interested in arguing about that. I'm just saying that the idea that Robert Malley, who is genuinely working for a Palestinian-Israeli accommodation, the idea that he's anti-Israel is just ridiculous, okay?
Well, I mean, listen, I don't like the debate being anti-Israel or pro-Israel. It's kind of a meaningless statement, okay? Mm-hmm. It's like calling someone a fascist, okay? It doesn't mean anything anymore. All right, so I'm with you on that, but I would say this, is that Rob Malley has said very clearly he was behind this letter, and he's made it very clear as not just an analyst, but as somebody who's sort of tried to affect, I guess, political change, that he thinks that the U.S. should begin talks with Hamas. Mm-hmm. I very much disagree with that, and I don't necessarily see how Malley's idea of kind of giving Hamas, which I think because they're not a state and not recognized as a state, more political legitimacy when, I think we talked about this last time, they are airing, children's programming, encouraging 5-year-olds to become suicide bombers. Okay, I don't see how that, I see it as at best very naive, and at worst that's not really for peace. I mean, I don't know what that is.
No, I think but naive is trying the same thing over and over again. No, I'm sorry, that's insanity. I mean, insanity, yes, trying the same thing over and over again. If we don't talk to Hamas now, then things will change for the better. Well, we've been not talking to Hamas for over a decade, right? How are things going? Those missiles still landing in Sderot? Yes, I think they are. Things aren't getting better.
Okay, well, I mean, that's one way of looking at it. I mean, you could argue that the approach of taking terrorists and trying to make them legitimate statesmen was tried in the Oslo years, and where did that get us, if you want to play that game? But my point is that I just think that you need to hold out at least, contacts with Hamas and recognitions of Hamas.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
And by the way, that undermines the entire policy right now of trying to strengthen Fatah, which is still at least nominally in control of the West Bank, and still is the party of the president and the prime minister.
I think that's right. I think that's right. I mean, I think you can disagree.
It undermines Mahmoud Abbas. It undermines Salam Fayyad, who's probably the best and most reform-minded Palestinian politician there is. And this is his policy. Now, I don't need to say that Robert Malley is anti-Israel, but do I think that that should be the policy of the next White House, given that he... No, I don't. And it's relevant. And the other thing I'd say on this recent, Robert Malley thing, my understanding when I reported on this 3 months ago was that the Obama campaign said he wasn't part of their team. So I don't understand how he got kicked off of the campaign or had cut his ties with the campaign.
No, that's right. He was a very, very informal advisor. Right. But, the kind of people again, these characters from the deep, dark recesses of the right kept on pushing this idea that this anti-American or this anti-Israel character was advising Obama, and finally I understand he had just had enough. It was just character assassination. So I'm not talking about whether you agree or disagree with O'Malley.
I don't know. You know what?
Malley's views.
I remember.
Let me finish here. Let me finish. What I'm saying here is that I disagree with the idea that certain ideas like this are simply out of bounds. That you need to try and shame and smear people so that they'll distance themselves from candidates. I mean, Robert Malley's views are fully within the mainstream of the debate in Israel. They are fully... It's only here in the United States where these ideas are, people try to cast them out of polite discussion. I just don't think that's appropriate. I don't think it's productive. I think people who are as educated and well-versed... Excuse me? What?
I don't think it's a mainstream idea in Israel. The Israelis are going to meet with Hamas to get Gilad Shalit back. That's about it.
Whatever. I think you understand the point that I'm making.
Hold on, but it's a little bit like if it's good for the goose, okay, then it ought to be good for the gander. Because I seem to remember a whole lot of Giuliani advisors who were getting tormented on the left and about what does this mean for a Giuliani campaign and all these extrapolations and so forth, when Giuliani himself was making it very clear that his policies were not the same as a Daniel Pipes, who wasn't even on the campaign, and the real guy was this guy Charlie Hill. And I remember when I wrote that, it was all the same people who were very offended by the treatment of Rob Malley were saying, nope, we're going to go with the original story. So, have a little consistency here, my friend.
Daniel Pipes, who has suggested that we put Arabs and Muslims in camps.
I don't agree with Daniel Pipes, by the way. My point is that it's not a mainstream position to say that we ought to,
Rob Malley and Daniel Pipes. Okay, right. That's what I'm saying. I don't accept that equivalent.
Okay, well, that's because you come from the left and I come from the right. But however, my point is that if you're going to make the point about advisors and candidates being different than advisors and so forth, then I'd like to have seen that consistency. I mean, I seem to remember a certain blogger calling, because of all the... anyway, my point is that let's just have some consistency. It's frankly how the politics game is played, and it seems that none of these sensitivities exist when the other candidate is on the right, and when the candidate is on the left, it's, I understand it. You agree with Rob Malley's approach. I don't. And it says something, and we should be able to have that conversation without resorting to name-calling and just to do it on the sort of substance of it. But that said, I'm glad Malley is not part of the Obama campaign, because I think Obama's going to be president. All right, well, I think was that about it?
You think Obama's going to be president?
Yes, I do. Because you know why?
Why?
Gasoline is going to be $4 a gallon.
Yeah.
It's going to be very difficult for the Republican
candidate. So that's what it's going
to
come down to, the price of gas, you think?
The gas is having a ripple effect on the economy. I think Obama's going to win because gasoline is going to be $4 a gallon, and we don't even know what all that means yet for the economy. And so I think there will be a President Obama who I think actually will probably not dismantle most of the Bush kind of counterterrorism and national security policies and end up forcing a bit of a crisis and schism on the left.
Really? That's
my prediction.
That's for next time, the coming schism on the left.
The coming schism. If I could, at the very end, if anyone's still watching, I just wanted to say a couple things. First of all, to our mutual friend Robert Farley of Lawyers, Guns, and Money, this is not a marijuana cigarette. It's a Marlboro Light cigarette. I don't smoke marijuana cigarettes on the Blogging Heads. It'd be crazy, and I just want to tell any kids watching, pass on grass. 2, Joel Cairo. Yes, crack is whack. 2, Joel Cairo, Bloggin' Noggin, and BJ Keefe. Good looking out. I do read the comments. Thank you very much. Those have been very constructive, and I appreciate your constructive criticism and nice things to say. And finally, Matt, do you know this blog, Unfogged? Have you heard of them?
Yes, I do know that blog.
Okay, anyway, you guys did a whole thing on how ugly I was. Anyway, grow up, 3-year-olds. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. And I hope you enjoyed this Blogging Hits.
Okay, cutie.
All right. You know I'm pretty. Unfogged. Right. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.